everybody, Carmen here with Quality Sewing, and for this week's How Do I, we are going over how do I know what those quilting terms mean. So previously, we did a segment on the top 10 sewing terms, and when I was researching that, I realized that there are so many different sewing terms. So we are making different segments that are based off of the terms for the specific sewing technique. So today we're going to talk about quilting, and we're going to talk about the top 10 quilting terms. So if you are new to quilting, this is a great way for you to learn what some of those words mean and how they all sort of like work together. Like, what is the difference between piecing and quilting anyway? What is a dog ear? We're going to cover that today. So the first term that we have here is piecing. So piecing, this is stitching together of the different shapes that lead to make a block. The design of the pieces depends on what you want. So like right here, you can see we have something that has already been pieced. You can see we've got little squares here that have been pieced. So what you're doing is you are piecing. And piecing is honestly one of my favorite parts of quilting because that's where you get to take and make really fun shapes, use really fun colors, make the pattern that is going to make the front of your quilt. So the next thing we have here is a 1/4 inch. So their seam allowance is in every type of sewing, right? But why is it that quilting has a 1/4 inch seam allowance? If you've been used to doing garments, you probably have had a larger seam allowance than a 1/4 inch. But the reason why for quilting that we have a 1/4 inch or a scant 1/4 inch is because that way you don't have a lot of bulky seams and fabric in the top of your quilt. Now the key here is, I often get the question of like, well, why would I do a 1/4 inch versus a scant 1/4 inch? This is actually personal preference. Some quilters really just do a 1/4 inch all the time. Some prefer a scant. Either way is perfect. You just want to make sure you do the same thing for the entire quilt because otherwise your seams won't line up perfectly if you're trying to make like a star or something. So you just want to pick what your seam allowance is going to be and make it identical for everything that you piece. So when you're talking about a 1/4 inch, there is a really cool foot here called a 1/4 inch foot, and this is a straight stitch foot, so your needle will stay in the straight stitch position. And when you're quilting, you want to be in that straight stitch position because you get a better, straighter stitch. And what's cool about this foot is it has a cool flange here, so that way when I'm doing my 1/4 inch, all I have to do is line my fabric up to that flange and I get a perfect 1/4 inch every time. Yes, it is that easy. So I'm going to snap this foot on here, and we are going to go on to our next sewing term, which is chain piecing. I love chain piecing because it is so much easier and faster than just traditional piecing. So chain piecing is where you are just going to sew 2 of your pieces together and then keep going and keep going, so I can demonstrate that for you. And we're just going to start sewing here. And I'm just going to sew this, and then I'm going to go right on here and just sew right into the next one. And it's called chain piecing because I'm not stopping in between. And so it's super easy. It makes it so much faster because now, look at this, I have these 3 made all in the same time. I have 3 of them here, and then all you do is you just trim them, and voila, you have this done here, and you have your perfect 1/4 inch. Super easy. I love chain piecing. Really, as you know, if you've watched my videos, I like anything that makes it a little bit faster because, I love to sew, of course, but we all want to get our projects done as quickly as possible so we actually finish them, right? Okay, so the next thing is dog ears. What are dog ears anyway, and what makes them? So after you are sewing a half square triangle or diamonds, the dog ears are those little points of fabric that stick out at the end of the joints. So here, when we look at this one that I have right here, the dog ears on this one were right here on the end. So if you can see this here on the edge, it would have come out to a straight point, and they actually got snipped off. So the dog ears are those little guys that come out the end when you are doing things with triangles, and then you trim them off when you square up your block. You're going to trim off those dog ears, but that's what they are. Okay, next, we are going on to applique. So applique is a technique where fabric is cut into various shapes and then either machine or hand stitched onto the main fabric. So you can see here, I have a nice little piece of fabric. So an applique might be when I have a piece of fabric and I've taken a shape like this, and then maybe I've used an adhesive to hold it down, but now I want to make sure that this raw edge doesn't fray. So I am going to stitch around it. And this could be a standard zigzag. You can use lots of different stitches, but then you would just put it on your machine here and follow it along and tack that guy down with that stitch. So I'm going to show you some finished applique over here. So if we go over here, you can see this is this lovely Dresden here. And you know, some of this, like this guy right here, is an applique. And when we zoom in, the next term in our slide here is actually called blanket stitch. So a blanket stitch is a straight row of stitching that takes a stitch to the side every few stitches, and it sort of looks like a ladder. This is very common in applique. It's probably the most common stitch used in appliques. If we go back here so you can see it, it just looks really great. It has that straight line along the edge, and then you always want the teeth of that blanket stitch to be going into the applique itself. And this is probably the #1 stitch used for doing applique because of the way it looks, and it can really just add a lovely, almost hand sewing feel to any sort of quilting that you're doing. Okay, next we're going on to the quilt sandwich. No, this is not something that you eat. A basic quilt has 3 layers. So it's made up of a top layer, a middle layer, which is usually your batting, and then a bottom layer, which is the backing of the quilt. So for instance, you know, once you have pieced something like this, right? You've pieced this guy all together, then you would add batting to the middle, and then you would put on a backing that would give you the back of the quilt, and then you would attach it together. So let me actually, I have one more sample over here that I can grab. This guy right here, and you can see what we've done here, right? I have my top, I have my batting, and I have my back, and this together makes the quilt sandwich. So the next thing is, now that I have my quilt sandwich, how do I keep it together while I'm sewing it? So that is where basting comes in. Now, basting when you're quilting is a little bit different than some other ways you might use basting, right? In garments, you might use it for gathering. You know, basting is anytime you're using a very long stitch that is designed to not stay permanently, right? So for quilting, you need to take your quilt sandwich like we have here, and you are going to tack it together. Now, sometimes some people will use a spray adhesive to hold those layers together. You can use pins and pin little spots in like a fist apart. You can use that wonderful Free Fuse by Quilter Select. That is a iron adhesive. That's one of my favorites. But you want to do something to hold these layers together, so that way as you're quilting it, that's not shifting and turning and you're not getting like a piece of it rolled into the wrong spot, right? You want it to remain beautifully flat so you can do all of your quilting. So this naturally then brings us on to quilting, right? So let's talk about quilting. So we've talked about the piecing, we've talked about that sandwich, and then now we're going to talk about a couple different ways to quilt it, and that's where you are actually sewing those 3 layers of fabric together. So first here we'll talk about free motion quilting. And free motion quilting is the method of sewing quilts where the foot can move in any direction and make many different shapes. So I pulled this quilt out here to sort of show you some of the different types of quilting. So free motion quilting. So you can see here, this is what traditional free motion quilting looks like because it's got all the little squigglies and you're using a foot to just sort of go around. But you can use that free motion foot to do other things too, like here, we've followed this line here around the flower. And sometimes you might, you know, depending on what shape you're doing, you're going to pick the right foot. But this, you can see, it's beautifully done. And then what's really fun is to look at the back. Because you can see now, since it's been through all 3 layers, you can see how that fun free motion looks on the back and then those outlines. Okay, so let's go over here and look at this foot here. So this foot right here is a free motion, let me get a hand out of the way. It's a free motion quilting foot, and so it has a little spring here. Make sure, Mike, can you see it? Yeah. This goes like this, and that's part of where it's going to be able to hover, and you're going to be able to go like this, right? You're moving your fabric, and you will make the design to do those little squiggles. And there's lots of different ways that you can do free motion, but like almost every sewing technique, I highly recommend getting the foot that works for the job because it just makes it so much easier. So the next quilting technique is not free motion, we just did free motion. It is stitch in the ditch. This method is sewing lines in the seam line so that the stitching is nearly invisible when it's done. You usually do it in a matching thread color, and this is a super common quilting method because it's easy, honestly, and particularly when you have a foot like this. So when you're doing stitch in the ditch, this little foot is super helpful because it has a flange down the middle. So then if I had my quilt here, which I'm going to pull this quilt over so you can hopefully see it. Maybe I'll put this here over here so we can see it right there. So if I wanted to stitch in the ditch right here, I would just keep my foot lined up with that seam. And it's sort of like when you're driving, you want to look not where your needle is going, but you want to look at that little flange, and you can just keep it lined up right through there and do a beautiful stitch in the ditch. There are tons of different ways to do quilting, and there are so many different quilting terms. So I hope that you enjoyed this segment. We're going to have some more segments on different quilting tools and different sewing terms. So thanks so much for watching today. We're here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time for a different How Do I topic where we cover all sorts of different things. If you're not watching this live, please comment with your questions because we are always happy to answer them. We also love to know what do you want to know? We're happy to create different How Do I's based on what's interesting to you right now, so comment with those ideas as well. Happy sewing, happy quilting.